All right. Good morning, everyone, and hello to wherever you are. It may not be morning. Thanks so much for joining us to hear from Mariam Barghouti. Just wanted to share a couple of notes here. Those of you with our forums are familiar, but all participants will be muted for the duration of the event. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will put them in the queue for you. Use the chat feature for any administrative or help questions, and we will do our best to assist you. Please be respectful in the chat and Q&A, and we do reserve the right to remove anyone who is causing harm. And this event will be available on MEPN's YouTube channel in the coming week. I also just wanted to share that we will be having a little bit different format today. So instead of our typical presentation followed by questions, we'll be doing presentation, window for questions, presentation, window for questions to try to create a little bit more of dialogue that way. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A, and that will be really great. And so let me just minimize this here. All right, so on behalf of MEPN, I would like to welcome you all to our September forum with Mariam Barghouti, writer, researcher, and senior Palestine correspondent for Mondoweiss. So thank you very much for being with us, Mariam.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the space and everyone that's joining, all the labors that go into organizing these events and trying to learn and unlearn through them. So contrary to, as was mentioned, contrary to normally how this is done, I'm kind of opting more for a conversation or an engagement instead of lecturing. In the end, who am I, or who's really any single individual when it comes to bigger matters like colonialism or the Palestinian struggle. But perhaps maybe I can start with something with everyone kind of joining this forum, and that is to think of the word freedom and to define it. And maybe you can do that in the chat, kind of as I did right now. Freedom is, and maybe you can write a sentence or a few words, but let's see where we're all at in terms of defining freedom. And it is 6:12 p.m. by me right now, so let's do until 6:15. Please just write what freedom is to you. Okay, so far we have freedom is choice, freedom is lack of fear. Freedom is the possibility to live and be without constraints. Freedom is the right to take part in own governance, or freedom is balanced by responsibility to others. Freedom is everyone having the possibility to become fully who they are, their best angels. Freedom is the ability to go about your everyday life without repression. It does have its boundaries, and that is a respect for others. What else is freedom? Freedom is to live with human rights. Okay. What else? Kind of have a few more seconds. Freedom is breathing. Freedom is creativity. Okay. So freedom is a very, I don't want to say big concept, but it is big in that it encapsulates a lot of overcoming, a lot of realities that aren't very free. And in the Palestinian dynamic, freedom continues to be questioned, right? So I want to speak today a bit about how we think about Palestine, because that guides how we act towards Palestine. Freedom is also the right to say Palestinian from the river to the sea. And what we've witnessed last year during the Intifada of unity in the spring and summer of 2021, we witnessed that it was criminal to say we want to be Palestinian from the river to the sea, because that entails Israel not existing. De facto, Israel does not exist. It doesn't have any borders defined. If anything, it's just continuously growing and expanding on Palestinian lands, as well as Syrian lands. We have the occupied Golan Heights. So when we say from the river to the sea, it means a liberated and free Palestine, a Palestine with the right to breathe, and a Palestine where we can live life without the repression, and to be able to take part in our own governance, right? But sometimes that conflicts for people in that, okay, we believe in these grand ideas of what freedom is, but somehow on the daily, we're contributing to the denial of these ideas to others, and in this case, Palestinians. So what is it about the Palestinian cause that makes us question the demand for freedom? And that's what the Israeli propaganda machine built, a denial of not just Palestinian existence, but the right to say Palestinians have the right to pursue their freedom. And more recently, and it's 2022 now, that is more than 74 years of the Palestinian ethnic cleansing at the hands of Zionist militia and their ideology, is that more than 60% of the West Bank, for example, is under the control of the Israeli military and their armed settlers. What little remains in the West Bank is either exploited for its natural resources or also being taken, even what is constituted as Area B and A, and that means they are under the authority of the Palestinian National Authority, PNA. And that is due to the Oslo Accords in 1993, if you aren't familiar. But when so little remains, it also means that we're at a final breath. And I think Palestinians have been warning about this for decades now. We're facing an intensified armed campaign, organized crime, essentially, by settlers and the military, as well as politicians and public diplomacy, in not only erasing and driving Palestinians out, but avoiding accountability. Just in May, we saw the killing of one of the most prominent journalists we had, Shireen Abu Akleh, who is Palestinian as well as a citizen of the United States, and yet the Biden administration refused to provide any accountability. And we're well aware Palestinians don't have much leverage in terms of calling for accountability, because we don't just lose Shireen Abu Akleh, we lose Yasser Murtaja, we lose Ibrahim al-Nabilsi, we lose Muhammad al-Durra, and the list of martyrs can go on and on. So it brings us to how to manifest freedom. And that's really, these are the conversations that I feel have been happening mostly amongst Palestinian youth circles over the past decade. And that is, what does freedom mean in action? What does freedom look like in action? And it's often banal. Our demands are very banal in terms of right to move from one place to the other without risking being shot at a checkpoint or arrested. It is the ability to go to the beach in our homes that are in Yafa and Haifa that we're denied from. actively by Israel and by its allies, state allies, from Egypt to the US to the Palestinian Authority, in denying us that. But we're at a place where we can't keep explaining these details and dynamics of what it means to be Palestinian, not just living in Palestine, but what it means to be Palestinian generally, because we are a diasporic population. More than 50% of the Palestinian demographic is in forced exile or are refugees. So it brings us into this imagination of what is it to be Palestinian? What representation have you learned about Palestine and Palestinians? How much was it secondhand testimony? How much was it you bear witnessing? So thinking about these things will allow you, I personally feel anyone that pursues the truth about Palestine will find it without Palestinians having to relive and reiterate their traumas on the daily of what it's like to live under occupation. It's all very well documented, despite the censorship and media blackout that Israel constantly likes to do, because strategically it wants to impact international perception attitudes. So we're at a place where it's a sitting with ourselves, or we are asking the international community to kind of sit with themselves and ask themselves, why is it that they're uncomfortable with the idea of a liberated Palestine or liberated Palestinians? And why is it criminal to say we do not believe in the right of an apartheid state like Israel to exist and pursue that? So it's really less about knowledge acquisition. And I'm sorry for the sound, there's construction also happening around. It's less about knowledge acquisition and more about moving forward physically and tangibly and concretely. And that's kind of what I also want to unpack with you all in terms of how can we build networks of global solidarity that are mobilized. But I want to pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments or anything they'd like to add.
You're welcome to put your thoughts in the chat as well, or use the Q&A.
Okay, brilliant. And feel free to ask as we go.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So moving on to what we can do and what it is, and an intro, kind of an invitation to getting uncomfortable as part of the international community. And I'm assuming here we're mostly an international audience that isn't Palestinian. And it's getting uncomfortable requires also using a new language, right? Or constructing a new language. What we're witnessing right now is a complete delegitimization of Palestinians in several ways. One of them is the delegitimization of our resistance movement. The illustration of Palestinian armed resistance as a terrorist movement or these scary militants is a way of Israel to also maintain status quo in terms of being seen as a hero and not as a military nuclear power aggressor, but as a victim, where there are these Arabs that just don't want to be neighbors with it. And yes, Israel is not our neighbor. It is our ethnic cleanser. It is literally the regime and the force that is driving us out of our homes and our lands and access to our homeland, essentially. So moving from saying, oh, well, why won't Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad just put down their arms? You need to start asking maybe a bit more, well, why am I invalidating Palestinian resistance? Now, remember, Palestinian resistance is closer to kind of guerrilla warfare, while Israel gets space to not just develop its military power, but to use human lives, Palestinian human lives, as training ground, and homes as training ground. This is what we've seen, for example, in places like Nusaf Riyadh in the South Hebron Hills. What the Israeli state does by law, or under Israeli law, is it designates a certain area of Palestine as a military zone for military training, and eventually they claim it as state land, driving Palestinian families out. So whenever they want to do military training, for example, 3 times a week with their tanks, with military tanks, and live ammunition, they forcibly and most of the time violently move Palestinian families out so they can do these military trainings, so that they can make them eligible to be claimed as state land and later on created as rural Israeli cities. So Palestinians are de facto resisting that force, whether it's armed or unarmed, should not take away from its legitimacy. And this is a very important conversation that keeps getting missed. Palestinians have the right to resist. And if we're going to be hypocritical or double standard about it, then maybe we should look inwards to if there are any colonial roots that tie us to that way of thinking. The use or the illustration of a heroic Israeli soldier in contrast to the scary old terrorist Palestinians should also bring us to a very common argument that Israel or pro-Zionist lobby likes to use, and that is being anti-Semitic. That is the creation of an association of Israel to the grander global Jewry, where you say, actually, I'm anti-apartheid and I'm anti-Israeli colonial expansion. You're made to seem as though you're anti-Jewish. And the current redefining of anti-Semitism by Israeli lobby groups allows for maintaining an ambiguity in the definition so that to continue maintaining that being anti-Israeli ethnic cleansing is being anti-Jewish, which is not the reality. And constantly you'll see this being brought up, but it's also driving people away from speaking out. And in that regards, I urge, everyone to sit with themselves and also ask, am I anti-Semitic? Because the Palestinian cause is no scapegoat for anyone's anti-Semitism. And anyone, if you aren't anti-Semitic and you are pro-Palestine and anti-Israeli ethnic cleansing, then just be confident enough in that, because these are terrorizing campaigns that are happening against our communities. From universities, I keep seeing day after day new professors or journalists or students being kicked out of their institutions for speaking out against apartheid, and that also comes from a lack of community and supporters for these people and individuals, as well as organizations that are speaking out. So to not take that as discouragement, but to let it push you forward in that, no, it's not just this person that's anti-apartheid. Actually, we're all anti-apartheid, and the problem is being with an apartheid state like Israel. So these kind of dislocating of what has been, I believe, violently taught about Palestinians is how we can also move to healthy mobilization and action, that we can't dictate the ways in which different communities can mobilize internationally as Palestinians. But what we can do, is speak our demands, our truths, our goal, and that is freedom, the right of refugees to return, all the refugees, to regain access to our natural resources, to demand reparations and compensations for all the emotional and physical harm that was done on our lives, as well as our land. And you need to think about how you can contribute to that. The bare minimum is don't support the Israeli state financially or in collaboration. Why would you ever want to keep giving more money or keep funding, like the US does, billions of dollars every year for the military, specifically for the military, when you can say, actually, no, I don't want to aid and abet this kind of abuse. And it's important to kind of reclaim not just your own voice, but to allow justice to become the norm rather than oppression to be the status quo that we constantly speak about in terms of overcoming. Okay, I'm gonna pause here if anyone has comments or questions.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. Maybe I will, would you prefer if I mention them one at a time or all together and you can kind of?
We can do one at a time, a little back and forth.
Perfect. So someone is wondering a little bit more about the PA and the PA's relationship with the state of Israel and, you know, aiding and abetting the occupation.
Can you repeat the first part? The Palestinian Authority, right?
Yes, that's correct. So speaking a little bit more to that relationship between the PA and the state of Israel, rather than the PA truly serving the Palestinians as a population and as people.
Right. Okay. So the Palestinian Authority, the de facto governing authorities in the West Bank, was birthed out of armed resistance and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, and Fatah, and these are political factions, and during the first Intifada of the late 80s. And as a result, the Oslo Accords were created and signed in the US in 93 and 94. And these, of course, were preceded by the Madrid Conference of 91, where you had PLO representatives negotiating on return. And most of these PLO resistance fighters were able to return to Palestine, and you had the Oslo Accords that created the Palestinian Authority, which was meant to be an administrative body for only 5 years. In the early 2000s, a Palestinian uprising also broke out because we only kept witnessing more loss of land, an inability to actually heal as a community, and obviously no return of the rest of the refugees, and the complete neglect and isolation of Palestinians that remained in 48 lands. Those are currently Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. So during those years, the Palestinian Authority was consistently approached by Israel to help with the security coordination. That's how the relationship was established. The Palestinian Authority acts as a proxy engine, basically, in the West Bank on behalf of Israeli intelligence and military. And over the years, the Palestinian Authority increasingly not just aided and abetted the Israeli regime, but it also became more and more greedy, especially when we saw the passing of Yasser Arafat in 2004 after a besiegement of his headquarters by the Israeli military, and then the succession of that position by Mahmoud Abbas, who's currently 14 years past his term, de facto dictatorship rule. So how do you expect someone that is obsessing about remaining in power at any cost possible to ever serve a population that is not only vulnerable to attacks, but is becoming slowly eaten in terms of resources, access, capacities, and lives? So the Palestinian Authority is really worried about itself right now and maintaining power, while Palestinians are trying to pursue liberation. There is complete disconnect between the armed governing authority and Palestinian political, but as well as economic and social needs. So currently, even the PA and Israel have a fractured relationship, considering Israel's own internal political fissures that are unraveling. But the Palestinian Authority doesn't see Palestinians. It doesn't really engage with them anymore. It's going through its own internal dictatorship style competition over power and rule. But at that expense is people like Nizar Banat, who was assassinated June 24th of last year for exposing that the Palestinian Authority had purchased expired vaccines, Pfizer vaccines from Israel, and that Israel was selling expired vaccines to Palestinians in a vaccination exchange. I hope that kind of gives a little bit more history and a little context of why the PA doesn't serve Palestinians.
Thank you. I have another question of how do we proceed regarding and effectively responding to Israel's campaign to silence and defund the 6 or 7 Palestinian human rights organizations, the ones that have had their offices barricaded, offices trashed, and everything?
That's a really good question. So in its intensification campaign recently, Israel has also been targeting not just Palestinian families, but anyone that's documenting the crimes that are happening in order to avoid accountability. Now, the 6 organizations that were targeted and designated as terror organizations are one of the most major testimony collecting organizations here. One of them is Defense for Children International in Palestine, and they document the abuses and torture that happens against children in military detention. The other is Al-Haq and Ad-Damir. Both of them follow the cases of political detainees, as well as lands in Area C. Another is the Union for Agricultural Workers. And this does more work for Palestinians in Area C than the Ministry of Agriculture does for the PA, which isn't allowed technically in Area C. So what we need to do is first off showcase these false allegations that Israel continues to push forward in an attempt to place a complete blackout on what it's about to do, not what it has done, but I feel like it's about to intensify and escalate in the coming years. And at the same time, it's getting away with giving false allegations. So I think the most effective response is to not just be on the defense, but to also be on the offense. And that means showing Israel is lying about a very serious allegation, terrorism charges, in order to cripple a civil society organization financially and weaken it so that it can continue carrying out crimes against humanity. And it's sometimes we can't just keep protecting these organizations. We also need to show the tactics and the tools that are being used and to criminalize that instead of criminalizing the gathering of testimonies. In addition to that, donate to these organizations, say their name, use them as references, volunteer, see the documents that they have, provide more additional documents and whichever area that you're in, and more than anything, amplify their stories. I think that's how you can ever be effective in terms of giving a protection to either organization or Palestinian here. It's to keep amplifying, because what Israel is doing is trying to isolate. It's trying to dissuade everyone from interacting with it.
Thank you so much for that. And then in our follow-up email for this forum, we will share those organizations and links to them so that you can do exactly that, to promote, to share, to really amplify that, as Mariam outlined.
Okay, excellent. So maybe I can also dedicate this the third part of this talk to what can be done today and now and what needs to be done. The first was the getting uncomfortable. The second is an invitation to adopt Palestinian lexicon and discourse in terms of advocating. And 3 is what can we do? So there are several ongoing Palestinian campaigns that are prioritizing different needs. First off is Gaza. We need the siege removed off of Gaza. This includes calling your policymakers, excuse me, and demanding to know what they're doing about a siege that has gone more than 16 years for a population where more than half is under the age of 15, and most are refugees they're not just being imprisoned, they are being systemically killed in butchery after butchery after butchery. And I'm sorry if the word seems discomforting, but that's what is happening in Gaza. So demand the siege is lifted. Stop buying Israeli products. You are de facto funding the military and the settlements that are making Palestinian lands theirs, or that are claiming Palestinian lands and lives as theirs. So stop buying Israeli products. I think that's very simple and basic, and should be a very first step in terms of equalizing the power dynamics for Palestinians. We're facing a nuclear state as a demilitarized zone, for example, in the West Bank. The third campaign is in light of Palestinian political detainees. Israel is using administrative detention increasingly to imprison not just human rights lawyers or not just militants, but also human rights lawyers and journalists. So it's systemically targeting journalists under secret evidence that is never really shown to them or their lawyer. And some people have been imprisoned for years for absolutely no reason other than Israel sees them as problematic. So call and demand your representative to speak about this issue very clearly. Call and say that this is a red line in your upcoming elections in your area. Make this a demand of your candidates to be bold enough to speak about this issue. People are literally being tortured still. It's 2022. The torture tactics that we might imagine in Hollywood films are very real for us. And we really need that to stop immediately. You have Palestinians on hunger strike and children being increasingly attacked at higher frequencies, and it's alarming. So please engage with whomever you can about this to show the barbarity of it. Invite more Palestinians to speak about events that have to do with Palestine. Stop asking us to show both sides. It's time to just hear Palestine. I think it's been more than 70 years of hearing the Israeli discourse that has done nothing but increase crimes against humanity. So maybe it's okay to hear more Palestinians demand things like the release of Ahmed Manasra. He is a Palestinian who was detained at the age of 13 for an alleged stabbing attack that he carried with his cousin, who was killed immediately on the spot. And as Ahmed Manasra was only 13, settlers rammed him with their car. Then, over his bleeding body, started yelling, "Die, you son of a bitch, die." Excuse my language. And he's 20 now, and he has been in solitary confinement for years. And psychosocial workers and psychologists are warning that he will never be able to recover if he continues to be held, and his immediate release is required. Israel changed its law so they can allow for the detainment of this kid. So it shows you how sinister these prison systems are. Are there any questions so far? Or
yeah, we have one question, and thanks so much for the really clear outline of what we can do, and that will be shared in the follow-up email. So everybody keep your eye open for that and take action. Someone is wondering, are there individuals or groups developing that will challenge the PA for leadership?
Yes, there are many, and the PA is constantly being challenged. But at the moment, for Palestinians, I think after the Intifada of unity was kind of sparked, it's not an event that stops. I think it's still ongoing. But when it was sparked last year, we also emphasized that many of the youth were out in the streets without really a leader, but a compass of freedom and justice, and then to not waver on that in any shape, way, or form. The constant emphasis and asking about the Palestinian Authority also negates, okay, well, what's the alternative for Hamas and Gaza? What's the alternative for Israel, for Palestinians in 48, right? So it's really an alternative for all of it. One purely Palestinian election process that allows us to really be agents of our choice and who we select, but that can't happen until liberation. That can't happen until you have Palestinians meeting at least their basic daily needs. We're experiencing alarming rates of food insecurity and poverty right now, not because we can't, or that our natural resources won't allow us to be sustainable and self-sufficient, but it's because they're being taken from us, quite literally at gunpoint. So it's maybe there isn't an alternative to the PA right now, or any type of organizing Palestinian leadership, but that shouldn't be ever an impediment or an obstruction to not still pursuing Palestinian liberation. When we're able to heal, when we're able to exit crisis mode and state of survival, then maybe we can start creating a healthy governance structure and social relationships dynamic. Okay. I think that's kind of it, though, from my end. And, if there are any comments, I'd love to hear if there are any questions as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll leave our forum open for a couple more minutes for you all, audience, to gather any more thoughts, share your questions. Please make them really clear and to the point. It's easier when I'm sifting through the chats and Q&As that are coming in, so I appreciate that. Mariam, I have a question for you. A couple weeks ago, I think you had posted on social media about an organization that was working to, how do I want to say it, to preserve and educate a specific area or historic site. It was like an archaeological and architecture organization. Could you share a little bit about that? Because I don't believe the MEPN group would know much about that, and I certainly didn't. So I'm curious personally.
Yeah, so Saqia is this small space, and it's kind of a collective that was done by two Palestinians in terms of renovating the structures that were there that are more than 900 years old in some parts of it, and creating a sustainable space for Palestinians to enjoy, or really anyone in that area to learn from and with, in terms of preserving archaeological sites, to living in ways where you also take into consideration how you carry out your daily practices and the impact of that, even down to the level of the sounds that you create, the impact of that on your surrounding environment in terms of vegetation or different types of life there. It's located near one of most Israeli settlements are sprawled across the West Bank on mountaintops, which is a military strategy. So Saqi is near one of those settlements, Dolev, I believe. And settlers are attacking that space and ruining the archaeological site, as well as trying to take over that space, in part of increasing settler expansion. So, students and Palestinian participants that occasionally or constantly go to manage and care for that space are at risk of being attacked by armed settlers. One of the founders of Saqia was there during an attack, and the settlers even stole some of their equipment. So even at the level of trying to create healthy spaces that are sustainable, environmentally friendly, and it's powerful in terms of creating sustainable communities globally, are being assaulted and tackled. But they're also a reminder that these spaces are around. So if you want to support Palestine, and at the same time, your area of interest and expertise is archaeology or geology, then there are also these spaces where it can be a mutual exchange of support and knowledge. So I'm really glad you actually asked that question, and I'll send the link to Safia to anyone that's interested in speaking with them further.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Okay, so kind of here's a clarifying question on your action points. So in prioritizing, how do we support Palestinians, as most of us being white Americans here in the United States? So just to clarify, what is the best thing for us to do to support Palestine? Try to change public opinions and government policies, or send financial support and purchase Palestinian products, or are both and everything equally important?
I mean, I think there are things that are more important than others, only in relation. But definitely start boycotting if you don't already. Amplify the Palestinian narrative. Make sure you as well recognize if you're trying to speak on behalf of Palestinians instead of amplifying. And to not do that, because that's also problematic. But to also recognize that Palestinian representation is not the Palestinian Authority or any of these political factions that we constantly see on TV. What represents Palestinians is their demands, and those have been consistent over the years. So one of them is the dismantling of bare minimum, at least, these settlements that are not just crimes against humanity, but if you need the backing, also illegal under international law. For us, the entirety of the Israeli regime is a settler colonial state. But to, stop funding it, amplify Palestinian voices, and help us challenge the policies that apply globally. Palestine isn't an exceptional case. We see the patterns in different areas around the world. So the censorship of, for example, Palestinian social media posts is not just about Palestine. It's a reflection of how racist these corporations are. And if they're not silencing Palestinians now, they're probably busy silencing other areas around the world that are struggling against oppression or oppressive leaders. So it's challenging the ability of these companies to remain, despite their active participation in criminal activities worldwide, transnationally. So not just changing those policies, but maybe if we are able to create alternatives to them.
Thanks so much for that. Someone is wondering if you can provide an update on Sheikh Jarrah and Masafriata.
Yeah, so Sheikh Jarrah, some families had a court order where basically they're allowed to remain in the homes for an indefinite period, but that at least means some of them can still stay in the homes, but doesn't take away from the fact that whatever settlers took over previously is still taken over, while other families are still trying to fight back in the Israeli courts to at least remain. So what we need right now is to also delegitimize the fact that it's an Israeli court deciding on the fate of Palestinians when it has historically chosen land annexation, chosen dispossession, and chosen ethnic cleansing. So we still need to push for international accountability, not just for settlers, but also these courts and the judges that are in them. And in terms of Masafriata, they need support more than anything right now. The brutality of the military in terms of violence, just recently, I think a few days ago, the Israeli army broke both of the arms of an elderly man in Masafriata and then detained him and then denied doing it. And we constantly see this pattern. So there really needs to be active mobilization of demanding that military presence in Masafriata should not be allowed. and start demanding that policymakers make that at a bare minimum until we can at least make sure Palestinians are at least protected, at least in the near future, until we move forward in what the Palestinians in Masafri Yatta want and need. So it's to remain active and engaged with that. And I'll send a few accounts on social media that you can follow for the Palestinian community in Masafri Yatta. But yeah.
Thank you. And just to clarify, are you thinking of putting those in the chat, or you can also send them to me and then I can email them out to everyone?
I'll send them all, yeah, and then we can email them out.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Here's a question about evaluating information, more or less. So there is an upcoming PBS program called The U.S. and the Holocaust, sponsored by, among others, the Jewish Community Relations Council. And this person who's asking the question is acknowledging that that asking this question is before they're actually seeing this PBS program. So like, how do you evaluate, or what are some tools to evaluating mainstream programs on the Holocaust that pay little or no attention to creating the state of Israel and displacing Palestinians and the ethnic cleansing of Palestine?
Sorry. I'm writing the name of a book. The Holocaust and the Nakba, A New Grammar of Trauma. And it's edited by Bashir for Columbia, and Amos Goldberg for Columbia Press. And I highly recommend this book in terms of unpacking these different events in history and contemporary time. I think Israel continues to abuse the trauma and survival of Holocaust survivors, essentially, especially the Jewish community. And it's so sinister. It is so sinister to justify the current practices of apartheid and ethnic cleansing in the name of those that experienced one of the most tragic events in contemporary history. And what Israel wants to constantly do is to maintain that association, to allow it to continue playing victim rather than nuclear power. Or if it is seen as a nuclear strong army, it's seen as one that rose from the ashes rather than one that is stomping on Palestinian lives as it does that. So for me personally, I think TV shows or the creation of any knowledge sources that emphasize the Holocaust's relationship to Israel as Israel being a positive occurrence are a disservice, limited in research and knowledge, and pure efforts to manipulate international perception. And these are just the times where I rely on people's intelligence. We're not stupid. We can tell when something is wrong, and we need to trust that.
Thank you for that. I linked a link to the book title in the chat, and we'll also follow up in our follow-up email with that and other resources. Someone is wondering, what is your interpretation of the recent visit of Hamas representatives to the Russian Federation?
I don't have an opinion. I mean, I still haven't read in depth about the developments. So I'm sorry. Maybe once I catch up, I can.
Not a problem. And then someone is also wondering where we can read your articles and opinions and work that you've produced.
You can check out my articles on Mondoweiss.net. Other than that, I freelance, so they're kind of all over the place. But Mondoweiss is an excellent source and one of the more, at least news publications I've encountered that brave it they brave using new words, brave amplifying narratives that we don't commonly see on mainstream media. So
yeah, absolutely. And just the depth and breadth of reporting, of analysis, whether it be in video documentary, whether it be in text article, interviews. Yeah, it's really, really good, high quality. And if they also have newsletters, so if you're not familiar or if you forget to check them out, you can have topics and recent information reporting sent to your inbox. So recommend that as well. And so at this point, I will just say last call for questions, please. We'll leave a couple more seconds. All right, and seeing no more questions at this time, I just want to thank you, Mariam, for being with us and for sharing your insight and challenging us to think about freedom and how our perceptions and thoughts of freedom frame our actions with regard to liberation of Palestine and supporting and amplifying Palestinian perspective, experiences, and voices. So thank you so much for that. And our October forum and our annual meeting details will be announced in the coming days here. And let's see, what other notes do I have? We don't have a survey for this forum, but if you have any other thoughts you'd like to share, you're welcome to email MEPN@MEPN.org. And we'll also include some upcoming events in our follow-up email, including Mizna's Arab Film Fest, which has some Palestinian films. That's at the end of this month and early October, both online and in person. And so with that, I will say thank you to all of you for being with us. And Mariam's laptop battery just died, so she had to be off our event, but she says thank you to all. And I agree. So take care.